society so against idleness. Totalitarians are always very, very pro-work. Whether it's Soviet Russia or Nazi Germany, or let's say perhaps slightly less kind of tyrannical versions of that. Our own politicians are very pro-work. But Terence McKenna said, well, an idler is a thinker, and thinkers are not a welcome addition to most social situations.
Yeah.
So it's actually quite subversive to think, and the whatever you call it, the society in general kind of works to keep you quite busy, so you haven't got the time to stop and think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy. Thinking, it requires solitude as well. It requires, she has this great expression, which she actually borrows from Heidegger, that when I think, I'm out of order. And I love that because it captures when you say it in English, and she says it in English, it's not only I'm kind of like, I'm out of order, I'm not working. That's what it means, out of order. But it also means I'm out of the order of things. I'm out of the order of the social. I'm out of the order of
also
hearing.
Means you're out of order, mate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And quite often you might decide to be out of order.
Yeah.
Because you've taken time to think about it. And that's why Socrates was so important to her, because she had this, Socrates has this very annoying statement, which says it's much better to suffer yourself than it is to cause suffering. And you think, is it? Really? And he says, well, yes, because you have to live with the one who's caused suffering, and no one wants to live with a villain. And she puts that as part of the totalitarian mindset, is the inability to think is a moral inability as well, because you're not hearing that inner voice that says you're committing a crime. So, that's why she contrasted rather wonderfully, I think, Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi criminal who was finally brought to justice, having hung out chicken farming in Argentina and doing all sorts of other things in 1961, as she went to report on his trial for the New Yorker, very famous and now notorious reports. Incidentally, her and Eichmann were born within 7 months of each other, so they were doppelganging each other all their lives in lots of ways. And she started to listen to him, and she said, the sooner, the more you listen to him, you realized he just couldn't think. And what she kind of meant was he couldn't hear what his voice sounded like morally, politically, generally. There was no echo. And she compares him in an analogy I really like, a comparison I really like rather, but with Richard III, who often is played as a Nazi villain. Do you remember, was it McKenna who did a kind of Nazi version of Richard III, and lots of people who've done it. And she says, well, actually, he's not that kind of Nazi, Richard III, because he has all those soliloquies where he still is thinking. And then he makes a decision to be bad. So all those great, Richard III, so he goes, is there a villain here? No. Oh, yes, there is. That's me. I'm the villain. Oh, and then he says, shall I prove myself a villain? Yeah, I'm going to do it. In lots of ways, for Arendt, it'd be much better to be murdered by Richard III than it would Adolf Eichmann, because Eichmann can't hear that voice. So in Jerusalem, he's sitting there saying, well, the worst thing I ever did is I lost my temper to a Jewish guy in Austria and I slapped him in the face. There were much worse things happening to Jewish people than being slapped around the face in Vienna, thanks to what Adolf Eichmann had done. And Arendt's just sitting there, he said, what? So thinking as a prophylactic against what she calls the banality of evil.
Now, could I just mention, I mentioned this just in the sort of chat before. A couple of weeks ago, we had Paul Theroux on these events, and he's written a sort of novelization about George Orwell's 5 years in Burma, aged 19 to 24. And there's actually quite a lot of crossover with your book, and there are lots of novelistic elements in your book. It's very imaginatively done. I mean, it's an intellectual biography, but it's not an academic book, in the sense it's only written for like 3 people or whatever. But there are similarities, obviously, in their ideas, you know, and they were contemporaries. I don't suppose they ever met each other. But what about Hannah's early years? Can we do a bit of biography? Because, you know, what Paul Theroux is saying in this book is that, you know, it's really important to look at Eric Blair as he was then, these 5 years, when he was a servant of the imperial system. He was a policeman in Burma, as you know, probably most of the people in the audience know. And this gave him such a horror of imperialism and the way colonialism corrupted people. And, you know, you were just talking about Eichmann. Well, some of the characters in this, in Theroux's novel, you know, they're very unreflective, quite unremarkable, kind of boring people. He says back at home they could like barely, you know, run a whelk stall. You know, they're sort of mediocrities really. And but they're so sort of pompous, and so they make brilliant servants of the empire. What happened to Hannah in that period? Because I mean, that was such an important period in her life, 18 to 24, 25. And how did that form her thinking, do you think, Lyndsey?
Well, absolutely. I mean, she was born Jewish intellectual family, and thank God she was having quite a nice life. She was an only child. Her father died young, but her mother remarried. And if you think about how did she become the kind of one of the first theorists of totalitarianism, how did she put it all together? And the simple answer is, you're quite right, Tom. I mean, she lived it. So she went to Marburg University, where she had an infamous affair with Martin Heidegger, one of the forefathers of existentialism, who then joined the Nazi Party and became infamously pro-Nazi.
Which is incredible, isn't it? I mean,
it is incredible. Now, I've said this before. I've had someone email me the other day, cross with something I'd written. They said Heidegger was not a Nazi, and I said, well, that's the kind of totalitarian statement. He literally joined the Nazi Party.
Actually, on your side there.
Yeah, well, that's kind of where the first crossover with Orwell. She was one of the people who could see, her bullshit detector was very, very strong. And she has this statement that she says, totalitarianism thrives on holes of oblivion. And sometimes those are literal holes. So that's the death camps. Jewish people were supposed to be consigned to oblivion. But the other thing that's consigned to oblivion is reality itself, or how reality feels and how we sense it. And this is very much like Orwell's memory hole that he talks about in 1984. I mean, men have always tried, and I say men advisedly because it does tend to be men, try to make the world, But in this case, they were trying to actually eradicate reality, not just transform it or have interpretations or different opinions about it. They were actually trying, to eradicate a commonly felt reality. So that's two things they've got. She got that very early. She could see it happening. The other key thing for her is she was a political refugee. She was caught by the Gestapo doing some rather minor work in terms of the resistance work in 1933, just after the Reichstag. She was caught in a library. I love the idea of it. Of course, she was caught looking for anti-Semitic material, and she was kept by a Gestapo agent who happened to be a new guy and didn't really know what he was doing, and she was totally charming, and she sort of blew smoke in his face, and he found a way
how
of
old was she
getting
at
out.
this point? So early to mid 20s.
33, yeah.
A bit older, yeah.
So,
did she live in Berlin, or where?
Yeah, she did. She lived in Berlin. She lived actually pretty much near where I was visiting yesterday.
Oh, wow.
And she ran her first husband was a good friend of Brecht and other Marxists. He left, and she actually kept a quiet house for escaping people. She then went after she was released, and this lovely story. Her and her mum went to the Czech border, where there was a safe house over through the forest. What you used to do is walk into the front door and stay for dinner. And the front door was in Germany, and the back door, and the back garden was in Czechoslovakia. So then you'd leave, and then you'd be over the border. It's like a Kafka story. And then she went to Paris, where she worked. She said then she'd had enough ideas. She certainly had enough of philosophers. And this goes back to why she found professional philosophers and experts really suspicious, because it turns out the clever people quite often aren't that clever. And that's the great thing she says about, you know,
it's quite a Socratic observation as well. Yeah.
Exactly. And they're not they're not necessarily the good people. They can be the bad people. And the people who think they're so clever, they do real damage. So she wanted to do action thing. What she worked with Jewish refugee adolescent kids who were being sent rapidly from the East by that point, had been for quite some time, training them up and eventually taking them to Palestine. And so she later described herself as, in that time, I was a social worker who read history and political theory in my spare time, which I thought was one of the understatements of the play. But that's literally what she was doing. So it's really important because she adopted a pariah perspective